I think that just as we're living in a nuclear age, we have grown so tremendously in scientific knowledge, it doesn't seem too much to say that men can begin to awaken to the fact that they haven't grown enough spiritually and haven't recognized their spiritual capacities.
Once something like eating is death, then you've struck at the very heart of life. The enemy of the older radical theories may have been the ruling class, but today the stakes of whether we will reform ourselves into a new kind of human being, a new kind of society, whether we will find selves worth being, the stakes of it are simply life itself.
As modernity has created promises that it has no ability to keep. What this means is that we're a society of disembedded individuals, stuck in the impossible situation of being alone together. And what was understood as emancipation has proved to be a form of isolation. It is important to understand that what I am telling you is not simply a cultural history. It's a description of the story that shapes every single person that you know. This is why there is a rise in mental illness. It's absolutely concurrent with the disembedding of the individual, because individuals can't constitute themselves by the very nature of the case. Subjectivity cannot sustain its own weight. We need others to tell us. But we've been given an ethical mandate by the Enlightenment that tells us that that's immoral, that nobody should constrain us.
All right, so we wanted to spend a special session kind of reacting to our interview with Chris Cutrone, which we do plan on splitting up and putting out in 2 segments as well, so that people can just listen to the first or the second half if they want to. But today, before we move on to our second season, we'd like to talk about this interview because it was really fruitful. It was 2.5 hours long, right? Like, that's a long time. And there were a lot of things that we got out of it. I think it kind of became clear where we agree and disagree with Chris Cutrone, whom we always appreciate. So, you know, I mean, one of the things that we did is we asked Chris, just tell us how he got started. When did he become a Marxist? And we'd already read a little bit of biographical material, but he really told a great tale of, I mean, I would say kind of an adventure that few people have in discovery, you know, starting even in, wasn't it high school that he first got attracted to Marxist thought?
Yeah.
Yeah. And through a Catholic worker acquaintance, was acquainted with Marxist thought, and then immediately kind of took to it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and he talked about how he like journeyed through the various leftist groups he met in New York, and how to various extents he agreed with them, and then but was also repulsed because they weren't sufficiently Marxist.
Yeah. You know, I know we don't want to spend a lot of time on this, but it struck me as how personalistic his experience was, if that makes sense, that, you know, he literally, and part of me was like nostalgic for this because he grew up during a time, and I did too, when you could have these adventures, when it was easier to just kind of decide, I want to pursue what I believe, what I'm interested in, and see where it leads without a predetermined, you know, end goal. So even when he went to college, he was on this adventure, and he did it through these various people that he met, professors and activists, and, you know, he traveled. And I think a lot of people today just can't even, they don't even want to think, like, things have progressed so much that they don't even want to think about that. They want to think about, like, how do I get exactly what I need to get a job? So Cutrone had the freedom to do that in a way that a lot of my students don't. So I just found that interesting.
Hmm. Sure. Although I don't know, maybe surely there are still privileged people out still exploring
Yeah, but the
in that
the
way.
thing is, neither Cutrone nor I was privileged. Now, like, only privileged people get to have that experience. That was only a few decades ago.
Yeah. Well, and it's one more example of the regression he talks about. That was a luxury the middle class could afford, and now we're increasingly heading to a time where no.
Yeah, yeah. So all of his stuff about his education, and it kind of like grooved with what he said later on about higher education and how, higher education needs to be something that's accessible to everybody, and sort of pushing back against this idea that we should have different education for different people, or be overly sensitive to like heritage and things like that when deciding what content people should be exposed to. That is all like the product of somebody who got that, who wasn't denied an education just because he didn't come from a privileged background, right? And
Hmm.
so he had that experience and it opened up the world to him. And he would like that to be the case for other people. I totally, totally sympathize with that. That's been what's motivated a lot of my career. So I really, really appreciated that commentary.
Sure. Well, and it's another example of how, like in modern American terms, he's not a typical leftist. The fact that he wants people to get, I mean, he wouldn't necessarily endorse just a classical liberal education, but something adjacent to that.
Mm.
At least a modern liberal education, compared to that's just a bunch of, dead white men that, want to oppress people, and we just need to decolonize the canon.
Yeah, right. Because he recognizes that ideas are ideas, whoever they're attached to, right? They're either good or bad ideas. They make sense or they don't make sense. But who wrote them is of secondary importance. And that's an idea that's kind of lost right now. But he's totally right. And to take that away from people because they're not of the right ethnic heritage to be able to receive that just doesn't make any sense at all. I got that kind of education too. I appreciated it, and it opened up a lot of doors for me as well.
Sure. And the other thing he talked about, it was implicit in a lot and explicit in other parts, was how in some ways things have changed and we've regressed, but in other ways, how many of the problems that we think are new have been around for a long time.
Mm-hmm.
Whether, I mean, now we call it woke, but even when I was a kid, it was just called political correctness. He thinks we have problems with, or he didn't say this, but we think, oh, there's all this worries about voter suppression or messing with the ballots on both sides of the aisle. But, when he talked about the Republican political machine and how his parents registered for the wrong party and his grandparents got a call. I mean, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
He talked about the progressive stack. And
Yeah. Oh my
privileging
gosh.
BIPOC voices. Sure. So most of these things aren't new. Although he
That,
did.
I'll tell you what, I didn't know what that referred to. Somehow I think it's because I mainly resided in the Midwest for most of my life. The progressive stack literally has never literally happened in my world. Now, we have something a little less crazy than that. There's, maybe, but, very minimal compared to what he described, which is full on, look, if you're white and male, you just can't talk until the end. I've never seen that before in my life. Okay.
Well, it's because you're running in reactionary circles.
No, it's because I'm in Kansas. There really is a different experience. People on the East Coast and West Coast have a very different experience in higher education than out here. And they're very right wing here, but and because of that, maybe this just doesn't happen. It just doesn't happen. sorry, but like that. So like when I heard that, I was like, wow. We've had, okay, like I don't want to say we've never had anything like that, but there have been sort of like, I don't know what you want to say, social pressure, some political correctness, but nothing like that. That's kind of crazy. So I was like, what is that?
You really liked the discussion about the need to cooperate with religious people, even if socialism, in his perspective, is an inherently secular pursuit.
Yeah, that was interesting. I thought Chris was very open-minded about this. I mean, he obviously comes from a very, it's kind of like a correctly understood Orthodox Marxist perspective. And so in his world, what did he say? You know, we live in a secular age and we live in a post-Christian age, is what he said. Nevertheless, he recognizes that there are a lot of people that are motivated by religion. So I guess that's something to unpack, how you say both, but he was perfectly willing to entertain the idea of not only Marxists and religious people cooperating on things like, for instance, helping immigrants, but also even, you know, the notion that, I mean, what I heard was, in his Marxist world, religious people would be fine. You know, that there's no particular animus there. It's just that he thinks that's not what moves history forward at this point.
Right. Which, if only every leftist movement was as open to being patient with people's beliefs.
Yeah, well, aren't they going to have to be? I mean, isn't this a big problem with a lot of with Marx himself, as well as a lot of Marxists, is that they want to aid the working class or see the working class as the revolutionary subject, but the working class has always tended to be religious. And this has always been the biggest problem. It's seen as retrograde, right? Like, you have to get rid of that religious sentiment before you can fully embrace modernity and move forward into socialism. But the working class sort of stubbornly has remained religious, right? So like at a certain point, they have to grapple with that. And I think we saw Chris Cutrone trying to grapple with that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, with a question he's not asked by his usual set of interlocutors.
Definitely. Yeah. And I thought he did a pretty good job, you know, considering his like set of beliefs and commitments, you know. But so do you remember that point in the interview where we started talking about how, well, okay, there was this point where he identified himself as, more or less, quote, the last Marxist, right? And the idea being that there are very few leftists who really are committed to Marxism, that most of them have been co-opted somehow. And so, you know, the time for true Marxism isn't now, but he's looking for that long durée, the long, he takes that longer perspective, and he's kind of like, you know, we need this message in the bottle because this shit's going to go down, you know, and when it does, there needs to be this understanding, right? So this is what Platypus is about. And I think I asked, more or less, like, couldn't you see Judeo-Christianity in the same way, right? That we're living during a time where you might say we're living in a secular age, as he says, that where people have kind of forgotten the core, like, true living faith. But nevertheless, like it's got a long durée. It's been around a long time. It's a narrative that, that many, many people still understand and know. What makes the two different as far as the hopefulness for the future? Which one ought to be in that bottle? Or maybe they should both be in there.
Sure. Well, and I think what makes them obvious, one of the major things that makes them obviously different is one is founded upon a claim that like the creator of the universe has revealed this set of ideas.
Mm-hmm. Revelation.
And then the other one, you're just saying that Marx has been one of the most acute interpreters of human nature and historical development, and therefore his ideas, instead of as a prophet, he's a scientist, and that's why his ideas are the best and deserve to be preserved.
Mm-hmm. Which embraces, the assumptions of the Enlightenment that human reason can kind of conquer all, and we don't necessarily need to have faith.
Sure. And I think it was really telling when you were talking about teaching the classics, and he says, "Oh, the classics, right? Like Kant."
Yeah, right. He didn't go farther back than that. I was quite pleased that Chris does have a knowledge and appreciation for teaching these texts, and clearly does so. But yeah, like in his mind, the most important turning point, I think, is in that zone of the Enlightenment. And so he's embraced that. Now, ironically, that's a little bit like a faith in and of itself. I mean, I felt like both of us were talking about our faiths, really,
Sure.
So I guess my question for him might be next time is like, why can't they both be in the bottle? I think we started to talk about that towards the end, and I think, for him at this moment, when we were talking to him, the question or the answer was, well, they can sort of both be in the bottle, but one is going to fade out because it doesn't match up with modernity, right? That it's already been sort of superseded, and it's a matter of time before the world is entirely secular. But I don't know if that's obvious.
Sure. Well, and I think there is at the core of a modern outlook and just a pre-modern outlook at all, there is an inherent dispute of the nature of just, I think, everything: reality, authority, meaning. And most people, whatever side they're on, we don't want to fully embrace the intense cognitive dissonance because most people, they want to live with some hybrid of the two, even if, in Kansas City, I know all of these allegedly secular people that are obsessed with tarot and astrology, which doesn't really square, but I mean, it's an ersatz religion. And so on the one hand, nothing's true, and I should be able to live my life, but also I'm governed by the stars, and also I'm following dubious traditions telling me how to find out what the stars are guiding me to as well. That's just one example.
People still believe that stuff.
Sure. And on the other end, there's lots of religious people that it's hard to live in the cognitive dissonance of, basically liberal capitalist nihilism.
Right.
6 days a week. And then what do you do when you go to church on Sunday?
Yeah.
This was an old Joseph Campbell spiel that we spend 6 days with Prometheus and then 1 day with Job, and then we wonder why we're on the psychiatrist chair on Monday.
Yeah, that's an excellent point, right? And so when I'm thinking about the two of these two kind of, if you want to put it, faiths, faith in enlightenment, faith in Christ or some other religious faith. both of them have like origin stories, and both of them rely on kind of going back to this sort of like pre-civilized state. For Marxists, at least as I recall, it's kind of like the original communalism, right?
Primitive communism.
Yeah, primitive communism, that the people originally didn't even know what property was, and that this is kind of like the original state and the best state. And then we invented it's kind of Rousseauian in this. I'm probably telling it wrong, but like, so property gets invented, and pretty soon
The fall.
Yeah, exactly. So we've got that story. And then for, Judeo-Christianity and other religions as well, there are origin stories that pull from the, or at least imagine an ancient past. And in our faith, it's the Garden of Eden. There's no property there as well. I've always been fascinated by the overlap between the two, and how much of it does rely upon a sort of narrative and story, even though one claims to be more scientific than the other.
Sure. Right. And just to add to that, the liberals have their own origin story about basically primitive anarchy and fighting with each other. And that's why we had to invent property in the state. Sure. Well, and I think what it speaks to is our need to rationally have stories in continuity with like the birth of our species and how we got here.
Yeah, right. And I know you don't you've reacted in the past to like the narrative stuff, as though, like the Hauerwas argument that people are people of narratives, or how we understand ourselves is in the line of story. But would you be willing to kind of like, at least for this argument, entertain that these two ways of thinking tell us a story about ourselves, our origins, and our future?
Yes.
Okay. And so in some way we're really telling parallel stories. That's kind of the way I felt when I was talking to Chris, is that, we're telling parallel stories. They both have a claim to people's allegiance, and they're kind of like artificially pitted against each other.
Sure. I would say somewhat artificially, because I would argue they are intrinsically essentially pitted against each other.
How so? Explain that.
Well, because at their core, let's just reduce it to Christianity versus Marxism, or just secular modernity, period. In the one, you have the idea that there's a creator who has ordered things in specific ways, including ourselves. And as human beings, we find freedom in conforming ourselves to these laws. And there are dire consequences if we don't. And as well as there's a metaphysical level of reality where because of the fall, there is like a spiritual war between forces of good and evil. And so not only do we need to stay faithful to our spouses instead of beat them up because it's a good thing intrinsically, but also because it is like a flashpoint of a cosmic war.
Okay.
And then the other, would you add anything to the Christian cosmology?
I think I might contemplate subtracting the emphasis on dire consequences if you do not. In other words, I'm somewhat uncomfortable with, and I'm not sure how you meant it either, but like with the sort of negative aspect of and the sort of moralism strain, right? Like, so
sure.
Not
but
that
I think that's
yeah.
But morality, underlying everything I said there, trying to articulate that narrative, is a morality and like an authority creating creating and regulating, creating and maintaining that morality. It's inherently moralistic.
Interesting. Yeah, like I guess not to get too far into the weeds, I think I agree that there's an inherently moralistic aspect to it. I don't think that's the major, that's like the most important message. And I think that Chris Cutrone thought it. I think he did think that that is the most important message of Christianity. And that was where he contrasted his own Marxism with that kind of moralism, whereas the most important thing is literally the relationship with God, or knowledge of God, right? And the relationship with it, which transcends morality. It's not about morality. I mean, the created world is about morality, right? Because there's structure in it that I think we both agree there's a certain structure, whether you call it natural law or whatever, that kind of, shapes what you can and cannot do successfully and kind of guides people morally. But is that like the expression of God in the world, the most important accessible point, the point that people should ultimately strive for? I think it's beyond that. I doubt if you would disagree with that, though.
No, but I would say that's a pretty like esoteric take on what Christianity. I think that is closer. I mean, I'm a big aficionado of Nikolai Berdyaev, and that's his whole argument. It's beyond good and evil. But
yeah,
but by that he means it's like more good than good, and the good has to be affirmed in a way. So we're kind of splitting hairs, I think.
Okay. That's all right. You don't have to like go. This is a whole nother like discussion to go into.
Right.
But
it'll turn into a Catholicism versus Word of Life. Right. Really what it'll boil down to.
Right.
But I think that is a pretty fair articulation of, I would argue, pretty much every, or at least to the extent I have explored these things, every pre-modern worldview is that there's some origin of being, everything has meaning, and people are basically like glorified ants in the face of all of these wider activities of the gods of historical epochs. We are very tiny. We need to accept our position, and we need to conform. And our freedom is through the conforming. Now that's a little crude. That's not, most religions aren't denying that people are free or don't have agency. But this is in marked contrast to the idea that no, all of these narratives, all of these mythological origin stories are fictitious, except our real one, whether it's primitive communism or primitive like barbarism. And there are no gods, there are no demons, there are no angels. There's just matter and your interior subjective experience and other human beings' interior subjective experiences. And how do we create a society on this basis? Which from the pre-modern stance can be accused of basically being, well, at worst, like functionally evil, because in denial of all the metaphysical realities of the world. But also it functional, I think it's true, but I'm a Catholic. It's nihilistic, I think, because it denies not only the existence of these metaphysical realities, but therefore like meaning, inherent meaning itself. And then we have to create meaning. And these are interesting theories. It's hard to believe in 2022 when you look at the society and the people around you, or at least it is for me, to think that we're doing a good job of creating meaning and community and sanity, let alone abundance.
Sure. Yeah. Like one is a secular faith with secular aims that can't get beyond that. And so it's inherently materialistic. That's the Marxist perspective. And I think Chris, reflected that.
Right.
Right. And so, his goal as sort of the fruition or flourishing of the human being is one in which people have enough material substance and they can also flourish as far as like what they wish to do with their lives. I think that's pretty clear. Including if they want to be religious, they can, which is kind of like, you know, some things from liberalism carry over for him, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. And it's a lot easier to do that in America as it's constituted now compared to like, okay, you're a revolutionary and you're in Spain. Well, like the church is not neutral. It's not just for us, it's a vaguer matter of like, can we use it to organize people? Do we find meaning? Do we have genuine mystical experiences? But like, if your point is to pull off a revolution in Spain, you have, you know, coalitions of throne and altar. And from that secular perspective, why not burn and pillage?
Yeah, right. So the moral issue comes into play there in an important way, because I think that, I mean, and he was quite honest, right? Like in the revolution or in any sort of revolution that's Marxist, there's a roll of the dice. There's all sorts of risks. Many bad things are going to happen. You know, religious people can kind of hope that they'll be forgiven for this, but you know, bad things are going to happen or may. And so I think he was quite consistent in saying that, right? And quite honest. But the question for us is that really the best we can do? And are there not some natural limits or some guidelines, right? In as much as we want, say, to supersede capitalism by something better, would we agree that we have to do or will do a lot of bad things in order to achieve that? I thought that was an interesting point.
Sure. Well, and it's easier for him to accept than a more temperamentally moralistic person to be like, well, yeah, sometimes to like make something new, you're going to have to break what did exist. And, you know, we got to weigh the pros and the cons. And partly I think why most people, most secular, modern, liberal people don't go as far as Cutrone is that at the end of the day, they do want a Dostoevsky and Grand Inquisitor. They don't actually want to say, I'm making this arbitrary choice to gamble with my life and other people's lives. And I'm going to do this because I'm hoping we're going to get somewhere better. They don't want that. At the end of the day, for better or worse, when I look at all the liberal people I see, and maybe this is another symptom of the historical regression, that if they don't want to go to church, then they're going to avail themselves of astrology because they don't want to accept that they're just living wasted lives in the middle of a dark age. And the only way out would be to take an immense amount of responsibility to understand how the world works and to organize with other people. And they can't or they won't.
Yeah, they won't. I think a lot of people have been degraded to the point where they can hardly get out their door, let alone like decide to do something like that. But it amazes me, like what you're saying about like astrology. I don't want to necessarily go into it, but it's just like, wow, really? There are a lot of people out there
Orno talked about it a lot. It was one of his
who grasp at things like that. Dang. But you know, I mean, a more frequent thing is, I think, depression, right? Like the increase of just mental illness and depression in our society amongst people who don't have any firm place to go, right? Where they can get the boundaries of what it means to be a human being and what legitimately they should do with their lives, right? They're sitting there with this full freedom to kind of, within the liberal context anyway, to make these many choices. And none of them really like point to any sort of like meaningful existence. And this is where, you know, religion still holds a lot of the cards, I think.
Right. I mean, this is red meat for apologetic arguments, because it's the claim goes, oh, don't you see, you're depressed, not because society has miscarried the communist revolution where you can actually miscarry yourself. You're depressed because you're trying to fill that God-shaped hole.
Right. Well,
You,
there may be something to that in the sense that without that, people seem to flail around from one thing to the next. I actually think like Chris is very unusual and admirable in his like having stuck with his position and kind of placed his stake on this. And it's been very fruitful, you know, like advocacy of Marxism as a sort of guiding thread through his life and for other people. For most people, could it fill that role? I do kind of doubt it. I mean, I see a lot of people, they go through a Marxist phase and then they move on. They do some, you know, they do this, do that. He would recognize that too. I mean, he sees it all the time. This is the malaise of the left, right? That's what he's seeing. But maybe the reason for that is because people are looking for something that Marxism doesn't quite fulfill, right? Like it, and I mean, really, doesn't it boil down to, are people, is there this spiritual side to people?
I think so. Yeah. Are we spiritual, or are we, I mean, at its most extreme, it's, are we spiritual or are we material?
Right.
And
just
and if, I think where you and I see an opening is by having a more esoteric interpretation of Christianity and having a more esoteric, you know, like Postonian, Cutronian interpretation of Marxism. These two things are so refined that they can be synthesized. At least we've deluded ourselves into thinking. But the fact remains that most people that under their understanding of either Christianity or the leftism, they would not go along with this, and for the reasons that I was trying to lay out about the fundamental disagreement, the oil and water nature of a pre-modern and a modern outlook.
Yeah, I suppose that's the real level of disagreement. It's not just that Karl Marx said, you know, I'm an atheist and, you know, like we need to get rid of the opiate of the masses before we can have the revolution. It's a little bit more fundamental than that. But you know, like I guess that's why I wanted to say, like, you know, in the contrast between pre-modern and modern, there is this kind of bridge that one could make to the pre-modern within Marxism if we go back to primitive communism, and if we realize that the yearning for communism is more than just, you know, a materialistic yearning or a class-based yearning, that there's more to it than simply wanting to eliminate poverty, as great as that would be. Okay.
It's a yearning for heaven, the beatific vision, what have you.
Yeah, right. It's a yearning for superseding the material to be able to grasp the communal and the truly human, right? And so even within I would argue within the kernel of Marxism, for other people at least, maybe not Marx, but maybe even Chris Cutrone at a certain level, maybe like conscious or not conscious, I think there's this yearning for wholeness, you know?
The mystical kernel and the rational shell.
Yeah. But it's not scientific, or particularly like, it's not scientific to say that. But that's where the bridge is for me.
Sure. Sure, as well. I mean, a lot of things struck me that he said that, like, in a way, there's something in his temperament that is very Catholic, in the sense of, like, he's very, we've been reading DC Schindler, and I've been reading his dad, is insofar as he's very much about, like, how do we be holistic? How do we be reasonable and integrate everything? Everything can find its place. One of his quotes from around the 43-minute mark, he said, it's rare, very rare, we have that context where we can put things in their proper place. And he was talking about it's hard to organize things that, like, maybe we're trying to organize a union, and I'm woke and you hate gays, but, like, we can get on board because we're trying to organize this union. But when we don't have a wider context, and this is what I mean by the Catholic thing, that he sees that we don't have a way to integrate what we're doing, and he finds it in Marxism. And I think partly it's I don't know, it would be too much speculation to say whether or not he picked it up from his time in Catholicism, but it's striking to me, and I wonder to what extent it is because he inherited this a kind of scholastic-ish frame of mind, and a lot of the people in the American left have not inherited that, and that's why they can just be drift from, like, different species of liberalism.
Well, it's possible. Yeah, it's hard to. We might not ever find that out, but but I do think that there's I mean, we could argue that the origin of the liberal vision and then the Marxist vision, and for Cutrone, Marxism flows out of liberalism. That the core of that comes from a sort of secularized Christianity. That is one argument. It's not necessarily an argument that every Christian, including Dr. Schindler, would agree with, but it is a fairly common argument, and there might be some validity to that. Like, Catholic Christianity, or Christianity more generally, is a universalizing religion. It has notions about inherent human dignity, individual dignity, and equality, and even, like, what you might call charity, right? That can be, and according to this argument, has been secularized. And so from that perspective, Marxism could be seen as the ultimate sort of secularization of it. Now, even if you make that argument, a lot of folks would say, yeah, great, it's now secularized, we don't need religion. I disagree with that. I think that it doesn't capture everything. It leaves very important things behind that people need more.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. And probably not, and you would say people need, I would argue, probably, like, intellectually, logically, we need to structure everything else as well. That put concretely, if we don't have the discipline to go to mass every Sunday, and if we don't all have a heavenly Father so we can look at each other as brothers and sisters, then maybe it's asking too much of us. If we don't have that basis, then how are we going to form an international how are we going to form a communist international that's going to socialize production on a global and a local level?
Right.
And one of the,
just on self-interest alone.
Yeah. And one of the big coups, this cuts against your kind of defensive Marxism, when Marx and Engels kind of took control of that, the whatever it was even called, the First International Working Men's Association or something like that.
Right, yeah.
When it was the flip from this still vaguely religious, the Brotherhood of Men, to the Workers of the World Unite. I think that is that's the point of the oil and the water, and where, at least probably as Marx understood it, they were ultimately irreconcilable. That, are we workers or are we humans?
Yeah, and I would say that is, I mean, yes, I think you're right. You can see it at that point in time. the bifurcation, but I also think it's partly just like at this point, ideological accretion or buildup, as in, has this been rethought in quite a while, or is it just a matter of people's temperaments? I know a lot of leftists just don't like religion, and there's good reasons why, right? A lot of religious people are very off-putting at this point in time in our development. So it's easy for them to say, oh, like obviously, duh.
Right.
Don't want to be that.
Sure.
And
and vice versa. Religious people can be like, oh, obviously Marxism sucks. And so
Mhm.
therefore what? You're cool with capitalism, which you and I would both argue is in the same way ultimately irreconcilable
right,
with a
right.
religious outlook.
A lot of these positions are just kind of stupid, really, in the sense that people who haven't thought it through as well as Cutrone has are just like holding these kind of knee-jerk temperamental
Prejudice.
identity type of feelings about it, and
Prejudgments.
exactly prejudgments, and haven't bothered to take a good look into what they're even talking about. And I feel like that's what I mean. It's probably a quest designed to like kill us off or something, but I think that's this marriage of like these two realms of thought and being are what we want to move together to try to find out, like with obviously I think it's fair to say with religion as the predominant higher factor, but how much of the insights of Marxism can we bring into that legitimately, right? Without turning it into liberation theology and nothing but politics, right? But literally coming to accept, because a lot of people, including Dr. Schindler, whose book is excellent, right? But they don't talk about economics. They don't talk about capitalism.
Sure.
And I mean, it's wreaked havoc on the world. And a lot of the things that they do talk about of a moral nature that upset them so much are things that have happened because of liberalism and capitalism, right? Capitalism in particular. So if you critique liberalism, but you don't move on to capitalism, what does that say other than you've got this blind spot where you've been taught you can't talk about that. That's Marxist.
Sure. Or the ones or the ones that will embrace that question, they go back to, well, everything's ordered by God and we have a more or less accurate understanding of how natural law works. And that's why we need to return to hierarchy, some sort of feudalism, some sort of nationalism, usually. And so it's already the ones that are, it's rare to find conservative Christians or traditionalists, the rad trads as they're called, the tradicals, they do seem to want to return. And part of me thinks maybe there is a very wise, prudent reason they do. And part of me wonders, is it because they're ignorant of the real critique of capitalism? And they're still trapped in what Cutrone was citing as the bourgeois right, that what they want is romanticized reactionary socialism.
Yeah, and that didn't go well before, and I doubt if it will go well now. Like that is a contrived thing. To that extent, I think that Cutrone is absolutely right. And anybody who just thinks we can sort of recapture or sort of rebottle something and make it work this time around is missing a factor. And you can't, if you can't grapple with what capitalism has become and what it's done to our lives. For instance, if you want to talk about the use of the body, which Schindler gets into in his book, right? Like, he talks about how, I'm on that chapter, he talks about the legal theorist who, says our body is our property, but not in the same way that liberals think it is. You remember this? Well, it leaves out entirely the fact that our bodies are basically used for great chunks of the day, and maybe arguably as long as we're awake at this point of high technology, where, you know, our movements and our online activity are tracked and so on, we are under capitalism, under the abstract domination of capitalism, which we talked about in the last semester, you know, literally forced to use our bodies in certain ways, or have our bodies used in order to live. That is a form of slavery, right? So they don't even see that because they are sequestering capitalism over here. Don't want to talk about that.
Mhm.
So it comes
Right.
down to, do
or
we
if they
want to
do,
be
it gets
prostitution is bad. Okay. But no concept that we're prostituting ourselves constantly.
Mhm.
Sorry.
Yeah, no, and I think and maybe this is a general human thing in the same way that Cutrone's like, you know, if you seriously look at what Marx was saying, most people that temperamentally want communism, they flinch. They're like, oh, this is too much. This is too expansive. This is too radical. I think that applies to conservatives, maybe even more so. That when it's like, okay, like you're really, it's one thing to talk shit about, you know, like the woke. Do you want a revolutionary reconstitution of society?
Mm-hmm.
Are you willing to risk losing your smartphone? Are you willing to have to sit at meetings and listen to people that you might disagree with and then try and have to work with them? Are you really ready for that? And I think at the end of the day, no. It's way more fun to like, no, let me make another video about how Marxism is wrong at its base theoretical level.
Yeah, right. It is a syndrome. And I mean, we spent a lot of time talking about it. I think Chris also understands it very well. A lot of this activity amounts to mental ation. And so, like, you know,
That's a what you cut out.
No, I didn't cut out mental ation. What?
Are you just so liberal that you just can't utter the word master?
So should I just say it? It's mental masturbation. And I don't know, social butterflyism. And it functions to basically stop people from contemplating, let alone doing anything like this, right? So it serves this great function. And a lot of these radicals, is that what you call them, are still in that zone. So, you know, even when they flirt with Marxism a bit, that's where it ends. But for the most part, you're right. It's anti.
Yeah. Well, and it's tough, you know, like I don't know where he said it, but somewhere Cutrone said kind of the struggle of his life, or at least his later life, has been how not to be, as the last Marxist, how not to be recuperated into a Democrat, how not to become apathetic and depoliticized, and how not to just be a total sectarian crank. And I think that's, if you're any kind of radical, that is when you are so many standard deviations away from the norm, where there's no way for you to be integrated. You know, it's like, take your pick. And I'm not so, and this isn't like throwing rocks at Cutrone. He might be a sectarian crank. Right? And maybe what makes you not one is being conscious of it, embracing it, trying to moderate that. And I'm probably depoliticized, I'm afraid.
Yeah. Yeah. I think he had a good point about using, or like at least taking, the political system seriously. That kind of resonated with me. And I thought about you and the struggles that you've had with even like taking it seriously at all. I think there's probably a happy medium there. I don't think I'd take it quite as seriously. Although by politics, he means like organizing, right? He doesn't mean like going and voting for either like Biden or Trump or whatever.
No,
but
I think he does means closely tracking it so you could see opportunities to like effectively organize.
yeah. And he, like as much as said, this is not what platypus does. Platypus is about, giving people the ideas other people need to do the organizing bit. They organize like at the intellectual level really well. They've got platypus affiliates all over the place, but this
well,
is
one of an early talk they preserved that has always stuck with me is somebody in there was talking about how, and it might have been Chris, it might have been multiple, that basically the left, we don't need to organize, or the left doesn't need to organize. They need to be educating people. To organize is to presume that you have a more educated base than you actually have. And so it's a mistake to try and organize when you don't even have that base of cadres.
Right, like first organize. First, I should say, first educate and then organize. Yeah. And that makes sense. And it's probably right. I think you've kind of almost despaired, and I understand why. Like every attempt I've ever been involved with to organize people has gone to hell as well. Like it's tough. So maybe Cutrone's dead on there, but this is what he meant by the political, right? And I think he does think that in order to get the job done, you'd have to get to the point of being able to organize the workers. And or he's not somebody who just like focuses in on the working class, but like organize people generally to do this more or less revolution.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But I mean,
yep. And for me, it highlights, for me, the center point of what he was talking about was, it was around the 1 hour mark. I'll insert it here.
Right. So I, of course, would like to, I'm not just a Marxist, I am a socialist, actually, politically.
And by that, what exactly do you mean?
I think that this society still stands under the task of realizing the potentiality of capitalism, right, and not succumbing to its pathologies, right? So I still believe that this society is afflicted not by bad ideas or bad practices or bad attitudes and bad psychology, but by an actual contradiction.
Which is?
I think that we suffer from the contradictions of capitalism, the contradictions between a kind of bourgeois, enlightened, liberal, democratic, civil society spirit of cooperation and cosmopolitan, universal, humanistic brotherhood, solidarity. I do think that that is an objective tendency of the society, that the society does generate that, while it also contradicts it and undermines it in a very harsh way.
And it does that by the vicissitudes of what the process of capital accumulation requires.
Yes. So in other words, I think that capitalism has a structural problem where to keep itself going, just as it is, requires massive destruction and crises. That's one way of looking at it. Another way of looking at it is that we don't have a kind of, like, the bourgeois spirit is inadequate to deal with the problems generated by capitalism, right? So we're kind of helpless in the face of capitalism, meaning it's not that capitalism must necessarily be destructive, because nobody wants it to be destructive, really. It just is. And that we're not able to prevent its destructiveness with the means at our disposal. We really don't have the means at our disposal, practically, intellectually, theoretically, to prevent it from being destructive.
Is that what you meant by the bourgeois spirit? Is that the?
Yeah. So it's this funny thing, it's like, on the one hand, the bourgeois spirit is inadequate. On the other hand, it's the best we have.
And would it be fair to say that like all your critiques with the different kinds of the left and, you know, even your parents and your upbringing, it was all of that is imbued with this bourgeois spirit, right? In different inflections.
It is. I mean, there are obviously different levels, different, you know, layers to this in social and political reality. But right, in other words, you know, we live in a society where people who all want to do the right thing are going to inevitably clash over that. Right. And so the question is, where does that conflict lead? What is the result of it? And I understand the struggle for socialism as, at least potentially, a more productive way of pursuing the contradiction and the conflicts that result than what we've come to accept as ordinary politics in capitalism, which is, you know, you mentioned the rackets. You know, these things exist objectively, you know, out of necessity, in the absence of something better. You know, better not in the sense of like ethically or morally better, but more productive, politically productive, you know, kind of can move us forward historically.
In utilitarian terms.
Yeah, in utilitarian terms, absolutely. So
Yeah, I mean, because to me, it's like there are still people imagining that the bourgeois spirit is somehow or other progressing or that everything's going to be fine. Like, I don't know how else you understand. Like, if you're a progressive, that's what you believe. And we're marking and, oh, yeah, well, the civil rights movement didn't give people of color real equality, but somehow or other we're going to keep marching, and Black Lives Matter, even if we can't explain it, is like getting us one step closer.
Mm-hmm.
What they're saying in a way is that the bourgeois spirit is adequate to overcoming capitalism.
Yeah, and even Cutrone is kind of saying that, because the bourgeois spirit just needs to move right on into the next stage. It's what will get us there, right? We have to go through it. And I, you know, like when I asked that question about the environment, that's exactly what I had been thinking about, is that that belief that he has that we've got to go through capitalism, and the bourgeois spirit takes us into communism, which is sort of the fulfillment of it, right? But you know, we're already seeing that, you know, capitalism is destroying the environment, right?
Sure. Well, and it seems to be, you know, if we're treating his Marxism as a faith, it's one of the audacious doctrines that they have, that history progressed to a certain point and it will not regress past a certain, you know, we can regress in all these ways, but we will never regress past capitalism. And we probably won't court species extinction with the natural forces we unleash.
Right, which this is where, you know, as much as I agree with some of the things that he holds, especially his analysis of capitalism, I just can't quite get on board with that. I between climate change and the threat of nuclear holocaust, neither one of which are negligible threats. I don't believe we talked about the nuclear thing, but we did talk about climate change. I just remain in a state of being able to entertain either one of those things overwhelming us. And I know that he, you know, when I directly asked him that question, he talked about green capitalism and how capitalism would, you know, capitalism was working on that and was going to work on that. And so there was this kind of like assumption, right, that capitalism, because of its need to continue to grow, would would take care of that, I guess, before communism, and that would then be carried into the transition to communism, which will have to take place because of the inherent contradictions of capitalism, which I think both of us agree there are like massive inherent contradictions, and it can't go on forever.
Mhm.
But one of them for me is that it doesn't take care of the environment, that it's obviously its weak attempts at green capitalism are so weak that it betrays like a potential destructor.
Sure. And also, I suspect if he were listening now, he would nuance it and say he didn't mean that green capitalism would actually solve environmental crises, only that it would manage it to the best it could, and capitalism will just hobble on because there's no alternative.
Yeah, he did kind of voice that, well, look, this is just, it's inevitable. This is what's going to happen. He talked about, people are inevitably going to be hurt, that there's going to be, especially poor people in underdeveloped parts of the world are going to suffer more due to climate change, and that this is just the reality of things. But don't you think there was ultimately that hope, or I mean, more than hope, like sort of confidence that the progression of our organization and scientific knowledge and stuff was going to be able to handle that so that the human species would survive? And I mean, isn't that what it's all about?
And whatever remnant survives will still be governed by capitalism, unless we were to figure out some sort of socialist revolution in the meantime.
Yeah, I guess it wasn't clear like what would happen first.
Yeah,
it wasn't.
Well, and I think he would say, well, it's kind of up to us. We're liberal agents. We could organize, we could rise to the occasion, but the evidence does not look good.
I mean, I would place my bets. It would be a very macabre bet, right? Like kind of like on any given day investing in the stock market, but like I would place my bets on things are going to fall apart, and then in the wake of that, some of us might achieve socialism, which would be far preferable to some of the other options on the table. And, authoritarianism will be in the mix for sure. That would be my bet. And if we get socialism because we can't handle capitalism anymore, that would be great. But I guess it's not inconceivable to me at all that things will simply just fall apart, and that different parts of the world will be faced with, well, now what do we do? And that sadly, there will be reversions to various levels of development beneath capitalism.
Well, and I think in a way this gets to the fundamental question where it's, and I want to be like, I'm really glad he talked to us. I've learned a lot from him. I really don't want to be disrespectful. But also, to put it bluntly, I think what we've been circling around is still that oil to water, the fundamental incommensurability we've been talking about, is that he still fundamentally believes in modernity, Kant, Nietzsche, Hegel, Marx, and if those are your horizons, if you are fully invested in the bourgeois spirit, then these wider questions of like the ecology and alternative forms of arranging society are at the end of the day like unthinkable, or at least like barbaric and unpleasant to even contemplate.
Right. Yeah. And I think that he gets about as far to that point as you would expect somebody with his ideological commitments to go, which was refreshing and interesting to hear him talk about this. But I think you're right that there's a point where he's embraced that sort of linear or dialectical, but basically upward progression. And it'd be great if he's right, I guess, as long as people can also be spiritual beings at the same time. But like, I don't know what that, I'm having a hard time understanding the basis of that confidence. Yeah.
And I've thought long and hard about it, and it seems to me it's, what do you trust? What do you put your faith in to believe in that metaphysical notion of progress? And obviously a part of why he's so interesting is he is way more sophisticated. He does believe in, he wouldn't say, like, to be clear, he is way more complicated of a thinker than, at least superficially, like he believes in regression. He believes probably that time is some sort of spiral. I've seen diagrams about how, like, we reached this point in 1917 and now but we never resolved the developments in 1848. So like, to the extent I understand him, I think he thinks that like every revolution after 1848 has failed because we've never done the dictatorship of the proletariat. That Marx learned these national revolutions can't add up to anything good unless you have international solidarity with the working class. And so on the one hand, he is not just a progressive, but I think what we've uncovered is, on another hand, he is, like, at a deeper level, he seems to be, if we're understanding him correctly.
Yeah, I mean, just based on what he said in this interview, at the very least, if not other things like, we both listened to the entire American Revolution series, which seemed to imply much the same. I think that, yes, at that deeper level, and thank you for the correction, because I haven't like seen some of that stuff that you've studied, but yeah, still, like, the deeper commitment is to progress. I think that would be fair to say. And that's where, and I mean by that material progress, like progress through capitalism to something even better than capitalism.
As well as subjective, going from superstitious pre-modern people to reasonable, secular, sophisticated individuals.
Right. To which I also would ask, and so how is that like really a better life? It's interesting, some of the students over the years that have been like confronted by various profs, not myself, but like various profs who kind of do raise this like ideal secular future, will literally say to them, so why would I want to believe that?
Sure. And it comes down to, what is barbaric to believe in? That there is no metaphysical reality, or that there is and we can know things about it. And that knowledge has claims on our lives.
Yeah. It's more than a choice, because I think that reason can get us quite a bit of the way there, but I do think that partly it is a choice. And what I hear from a lot of people, and just either by their words or by their actions, is I prefer to think of myself as more than that. And so whatever we move into or try to like encourage people to move into, in my view, has to confirm people as spiritual beings as well as material beings. Because there's just so much evidence that is who we are and what we want. And it just can't seem to be addressed any other way. I think Carl Jung was right about that, which is why I'm still happy that I wrote that book on ideological possession, because he voices it quite well. It is not fulfilled by psychotherapy or by retail therapy, or just about anything else, including depth psychology, really, can only get you so far. I mean, Jung said, you're lucky if the Catholic Church works for you, like that's literally his argument. If not, then go for depth psychology.
Right. And I think where you and I have this uh, where you and I have this friendly disagreement with Cutrone is it seems likely to us that viewing people as spiritual, and if people could view other people as spiritual, that is a better basis for, well, if they could see each other as friendly spiritual beings instead of dangerous spiritual beings, that is a better basis on which we could maybe found communism, and a better basis to incorporate these more refined Marxist insights into how problematic capitalism is at its core, than just a Kantian liberal modern secular anthropology.
Yep. I totally agree with that. I think that there's actually the Christian position, or really the religious position generally, relative to liberalism and capitalism, has been weakened, but it's still very much there, and very much there in a way that is much more physically palpable and organized. And even, I think Cutrone even admitted that at some point. He said if Marxists could organize and do things as well as the Christians did. Do you remember that part? Right? Yeah. Like, so that's a real substance. There's a lot of substance to work with still. And so,
as well as the claim that these groups are making ontologically, that the creator of the universe is upholding these institutions and the people in them.
Right. That's a pretty strong claim, and it's one that resonates with people. People still want to believe, and in the long run is more credible. I mean, I go back and forth between speaking as a person of faith and speaking as sort of like a political scientist and a social scientist of sort. As a social scientist, there's just a lot more there, right, at this point in time, as far as, people believing at some level, and people having like organizational structure, right? So that's not something to dismiss. And so, like, I think Cutrone's observation about, how Christians do things is informative, right? And I would hope that at some point, people of good will on both sides of that would be able to more than cooperate with each other, but to inform each other, like we're trying to do here.
Sure. Yep. And that's one of the things that makes Chris different, is that he even would talk to us and field these questions. Would that every leftist would do the same.
Yep, I agree. And I really enjoyed this interview. It was great. Looks like a lot of people have listened to it already, and I hope when I split it in two that we'll get even more listeners.
Yeah. And I'll add, I mean, I was feeling pretty good about how, like, I felt like our interview was maybe the same, like if you were to introduce anybody to Cutrone, after that, I'm like, man, we probably have the best ever podcast with him, or interview with him. And then I got on YouTube, and there's this guy called Theory Plebe, and I was like, shit, he beat us. He has like 3 longer interviews, and they're really excellent, but they're deeper. I think we still might have the better just pure intro. But if you wanted specifically Cutrone's more comprehensive take on what Marxism and Leninism looks like, it's up there on YouTube.
Yeah.
Theory Plebe, Theory Underground, something like that.
No, I think it's Theory Plebe. Yeah.
You found those too?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I have. I've found Theory Plebe generally. Yeah. Looking at the competition out there, but
did you see the little infographic he made for the second interview?
I don't remember it.
It's like from Star Wars episode, I think it's 5 or 6, when Luke lands with Yoda and he's trapped on that jungle island. And the Theory Plebe is Luke, and Cutrone is Yoda with Yoda ears, and he's saying like learn you will, and then R2D2 is there like pushing a hologram, but it's of Lenin. And I'm like, man, they went through like so much work for this stupid joke.
That's
Like,
perfect though.
yeah,
That's perfect because I think Cutrone's a Star Wars fan. I mean, I think that was quite deliberate, probably. Yeah.
funny. Yeah.
That's cool. But I think that we've got the only one where we dealt as much with like religion. I think that's where, it's a great introduction. It also gives Cutrone at probably his most futuristic, where he's talking about the possibilities of what's going to happen, whether it's through social revolution or what's going to happen with climate change.
And where I'm happy is we got the philosophical, the bourgeois spirit, the modernity. Crucial stuff.
It's a good introduction. So